Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is July 24th, 2023, and I can't believe that campaign year is almost upon us. Wow, in about a year, we'll be in the middle of the conventions and back into campaign season. One thing I know for sure, though, Donald Trump will almost certainly not be shot in the ear. I mean, come on. I'll bet you $100 he's never going to get shot in the ear, right? Who wants a piece of that action? Okay, fine. Just kidding. It's actually July 24th, 2024. And we already know this, but I thought I would have some fun with it. It's not a rerun. It's one of our short and sweet 1-hour specials while I'm away on vacation, enjoying this beautiful land, which is so needed in our country. As Sarah Palin used to say, now we have J.D. Vance instead. So I have to get used to what his voice is like. But maybe I won't. I don't know. Maybe he'll be gone before I ever figure that one out. You'll have to excuse the background noise as we are recording at the last minute so that you have something to keep you company while we're scrambling around and enjoying the scenery. And so, you know, the laundry's going, the dishwasher's going, there's a fan going, it's a little bit hot. So it's a little noisy, but we've cobbled together a nice show for you today, and hopefully we can put one more together and use it for Friday. If I am able to produce added bonus shows, I'll try and sneak them in on Tuesday and Thursday. But hey, we'll just have to see how it goes. In the meantime, let's roll out what I have prepared for you today. I would introduce it more precisely, but let's face it, I forget what the F I recorded already. I'm pretty sure, actually, today's show, focusing more or less, at the beginning of the show anyway, on the courts. Both Aileen Cannon's rogue Southern District of Florida federal court and the equally rogue federal Supreme Court, plus an extra added bonus at the end that has nothing whatsoever to do with any of that, but you probably needed to know about anyway. So let's get to it and get this background noise out of here. So I thought if I shared this article with you, but did so early in the week, it would still be, you know, fresh-ish and relevant. It's difficult to know, to predict or to tell the difference between what will be fresh news or evergreen news or stuff that isn't quite evergreen but will still be fresh enough. But here's my best guess. This is something I could easily have shared last week but opted to save for early this week. The dismissal of the Trump classified documents case is deeply dangerous. We all agree, I think. This, though, happens to be the opinion of Neil Katyal, professor at Georgetown University Law School, Law Center, as they call it, and, somebody with whom many people have had disagreements in the past in terms of, like, his assessment ahead of time of the likelihood that certain Republican nominees, either for the Supreme Court or as Attorney General, might in fact be straight shooters, etc., or respect the institution, but who turned out, it seems, not to have respected the institution. And yet, still, Neil Katyal is someone we want to listen to, at least on this subject, where we agree about this case. This is a July 15th opinion guest essay in the New York Times. Again, the dismissal of Trump classified documents case is deeply dangerous, and he tells it this way. Judge Aileen Cannon's decision to throw out serious national security criminal charges in the classified documents case against Donald Trump is legally unsupported, ignores decades of precedent, and is deeply dangerous. At a time when Americans need to trust their institutions, her decision to declare that the appointment of the special counsel overseeing the case, Jack Smith, quote, violates the appointments clause of the United States Constitution, unquote, will undermine that trust and the legitimacy of high-level investigations in the eyes of many Americans. Her decision is quite unlikely to survive the tests of time or even the appeal that Mr. Smith's office said he intends to make, but it will further delay a case that has moved so slowly under her direction that it was already virtually certain it would never go to a jury before Election Day. Judge Cannon asserts that no law of Congress authorizes the special counsel. Well, this is palpably false. The special counsel regulations were drafted under specific congressional laws authorizing them. And, he ought to know, because I think he had a hand in some of it, he reports later. Since 1966, Congress has had a specific law, Section 515, giving the Attorney General the power to commission attorneys, quote, specially retained under the authority of the Department of Justice, unquote, as, quote, special assistants to the Attorney General or special attorneys. Another provision in the law said that a lawyer appointed by the Attorney General under the law may, quote, conduct any kind of legal proceeding, civil or criminal, unquote, that other U.S. attorneys are, quote, authorized by law to conduct. Lots of quotes here. Yet another part of that law, Section 533, says the Attorney General can appoint officials, quote, to detect and prosecute crimes against the United States, unquote. And isn't that, in fact, exactly what we got out of Jack Smith? These sections were specifically cited, of course, when Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed Mr. Smith as a special counsel. If Congress doesn't like these laws, it can repeal them, but until then, the law is the law. I, Neil Katyal says, drafted the special counsel regulations for the Justice Department to replace the Independent Counsel Act in 1999 when I worked at the department. And it expired, right? Janet Reno, the Attorney General at the time, and I then went to Capitol Hill to brief Congress on the proposed rules over a period of weeks. We met with House and Senate leaders, along with their legal staffs, as well as the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. We walked them extensively through each provision. Not one person raised a legal concern in those meetings. Indeed, Ken Starr, who was then serving as an independent counsel, told Congress that the special counsel regulations were exactly the way to go. 8 separate judges had already rejected the claim that Judge Cannon has now endorsed, including, by the way, the judge presiding over Hunter Biden's criminal case. So, in other words, unstated here, but implied, is that, okay, the theory is floating out there that you can challenge a special counsel's constitutionality. And what we have in reality at the moment is a Republican judge who says, yes, with respect to investigating Donald Trump, special counsels are unconstitutional. And another judge, and I'm not certain which judge it is or who appointed them, but it's easily looked up. But regardless, another federal judge says, no, this claim of the unconstitutionality of special counsels does not apply in the Hunter Biden case. Republicans can't be investigated by special counsels, but Democrats can. That's the upshot of it. I don't know if that was what was intended, but that's the upshot of the situation we find ourselves in today. That's part of the danger. It is true, Katyal continues, that one Supreme Court justice, Clarence Thomas, recently wrote a concurring opinion in the Trump immunity case questioning the legality of the position of special counsel. No other justice joined that opinion, and even Justice Thomas did not come to the conclusions that Judge Cannon did. He simply raised essential questions about the office, and his questions ignored a well-trod tradition in America as well as the statutory landscape. We've had special counsels and special prosecutors since at least the time of President Ulysses Grant after the Civil War. That is for a simple reason. We need a system to police high-level executive branch wrongdoing, and the system can't be run by the president and his appointees alone. consider the real-world implications of what Judge Cannon is saying. Under her opinion, Attorney General Garland, not a nonpartisan prosecutor like Mr. Smith, would himself be required to investigate and prosecute the case against Mr. Trump. But Mr. Garland was appointed by President Biden, Mr. Trump's political rival. Doing so would open himself up to all sorts of accusations. The converse is even scarier. Imagine a future president suspected of serious wrongdoing. And can anybody imagine a future president or somebody who might be suspected of serious wrongdoing? I don't know. That's hard to think of. But okay. But do we really want his appointee to be the one investigating the wrongdoing? The potential for a cover-up, or at least the perception of one, is immense, which would do enormous damage to the fabric of our law. That's why we have independent counsels, and that's why we no longer have those, but why we have special counsels in their place. The idea is to take it out of the hands immediately of the administration itself. We had exactly that situation in Watergate, which is why we came to this. A special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, sought President Nixon's Oval Office tapes. Nixon claimed that the prosecutor could not force the release of the tapes because it was an intra-branch dispute where the president's decision was final. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision in U.S. v. Nixon, pointedly rejected that claim, saying Congress has vested in the Attorney General the power to conduct criminal investigations of the government and vested in him the power to appoint subordinate officers to assist him in the discharge of his duties. And what laws did the court cite? The very same statutes, sections 515 and 533 that Mr. Garland cited when appointing Mr. Smith. But, to hell with law and to hell with precedent, right? Acting pursuant to those statutes, the Supreme Court continued, the Attorney General has delegated the authority to represent the United States in these particular matters to a special prosecutor with unique authority and tenure. Judge Cannon tried to dismiss those words as dicta, meaning that they were not part of the holding of the case and thus did not constitute a precedent. In fact, they were critical to the court's holding, and it has been taught as such ever since in law schools, I would point out. In fact, they were critical to the court's holding and a lot more critical than Justice Thomas's one-justice concurrence in the Trump immunity case, which she cited several times. Decades have elapsed since the Nixon decision, and yet Congress never once altered these laws. That was so even though the Justice Department put Congress on clear notice some 25 years ago that it was reading these statutes to authorize the job of special counsel. Congress remained silent even after it saw presidents of both political parties rely on these statutes to do exactly that. And Congress's silence remained even after court after court in the wake of the Nixon decision read these statutes to authorize the special counsel. None of these were dicta, not even close. That congressional ratification of what the Supreme Court and lower courts found is more than enough to dispose of Judge Cannon's entire argument. The Nixon case is not the only Supreme Court decision Judge Cannon blew past. This year, the Supreme Court examined a challenge to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where the challengers said that the board had to be specifically authorized and funded by Congress. In a 7-2 originalist decision written by, yes, Justice Thomas, the court said that the Constitution requires no more than a law that authorizes the disbursement of specified funds for an identified purpose. That's exactly what we have here, a statute of Congress that authorizes the Justice Department to spend money on investigations as it deems necessary. Again, if Congress doesn't like that statute, it can repeal it any time, or it can vote to defund Jack Smith's office. And of course, Murdery, Trader Green, and others do intend to try to bring exactly that to the floor. That's the way our constitutional structure works, not by having a federal judge repeal a statute through judicial fiat. She is a federal judge, not a legislator. The Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, which will hear the promised appeal by Mr. Smith, has already swiftly rebuked Judge Cannon on 2 different matters for her decisions in the Trump case that were well out of the mainstream thinking about the law. This decision is on the way to a 3rd rebuke for her. Mr. Smith's brief to the Court of Appeals will write itself. He will presumably cite the Nixon case, the several federal laws enacted by Congress, and point to the fact that Congress has never altered those statutes that the Supreme Court more than half a century ago said authorized special counsels. The fact that court after court has read them to authorize special counsels and that Congress has never once questioned what the courts have done will settle the legal question in Mr. Smith's favor, or at least it ought to. You can always throw out the possibility that the entire 11th Circuit goes crazy. In his planned appeal, the only question left for him is whether to take the further step of saying that a 3rd rebuke means that Judge Cannon should be removed from this case based on her highly erratic decisions. Her conclusion that the special counsel is illegal is, after all, not one that is a matter of interpretation. Rather, it is one where there is a clear legal answer given by the Supreme Court decades ago and ratified by Congress. Well, that's all true, of course, but, is Judge Cannon entirely wrong? I mean, she's entirely wrong based on the record up to this point, but are all of us, in fact, just pre-wrong and don't know it yet? Is there some possibility that a Supreme Court, if they can manage to get this case in front of them, will say, sure, it's been this court's understanding for decades that this is the case. Sure, it's been Congress's understanding for decades that this is the case. Yes, it's been the Justice Department's understanding for decades that this was the case. In fact, it's been the understanding of the general American populace, to the extent that they pay any attention at all, that this is the case. But is the fact that a Supreme Court decided this decades ago of interest to the current Supreme Court? Not really. So to hell with it. They can decide that. Neil's entirely right here. Professor Katyal is entirely right here. This is, as we might say in another context, that is not how this works! I'm coming to love that clip and remembering that I have it. But it isn't how it works. That's not how law works. But again, somewhere tucked into the constitutional understanding that we've gleaned over the years is the idea that, well, if 5 justices say that last week made no sense to anyone in the world, but we want it to be that way, we're kind of just like increasingly arriving at the point in history where that's just the way they're going to start ruling on things. I mean, if you can see the difference between a gratuity and a bribe, congratulations. But yeah, it's just, that's the way it is from now on. And everything you understood about special counsels and the fact that every president, I think probably every president since Nixon, has had special counsels appointed during their tenure. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we skipped one here and there, but basically it's been a feature of the political landscape on an annual basis. Almost every moment of every president's tenure, certainly since the expiration of the independent counsel statute, when we started to move to special counsels, there's always been one. There's been half a dozen operating at any given time. So I don't know. Aileen Cannon thinks this is an escape hatch. Maybe she just does want out of the case, but I don't know how easy it's going to be to actually remove her. But yeah, I guess that's the next question. Do they argue to the 11th Circuit? I hate to keep wasting your time with these ridiculous appeals against, or the sensible appeals against ridiculous rulings from Aileen Cannon. But if it's starting to bother you, I mean, I have a feeling pretty soon we'll be back here with a 4th appeal, unless you guys kind of wake up and smell the coffee and, help us out here and remove her from this case. I'm getting the sense that she wants out of this case. You might be doing her a big favor. Something to think about. 11th Circuit, if you're listening, okay, there's my signal to you. Unfortunately, I don't have any gratuities for you. But, within certain bounds, I guess we could, apparently we can make that happen. Ready for another one about what's happening on the court and how dangerous it is? Here's one from Jacob T. Levy. I don't know whether he's Levy or Levy or what, but Levy. I've heard it pronounced several ways, by the way. But Jacob, we'll say Levy. Why not? Who writes at The Unpopulist. That is his Substack style. What do we even call them blogs anymore? Where he writes, Justice Roberts, you know who he is, right? Justice Roberts subverted the separation of powers and created a dangerously unaccountable president. Can you imagine with all of this presidential immunity? Well, okay. Of course, everybody's going to be contemplating that. So let's dive in. The court's immunity ruling will make it hard to punish Trump for his past lawlessness while inviting future abuses. I think that's pretty obvious to everyone, but he's got very organized thoughts on it, I am sure. The Supreme Court decision in Trump v. United States has invented a doctrine of immunity. It did invent it, that shields abuses of presidential power from criminal prosecution. In doing so, it has accomplished a constitutionally corrosive hat trick. It has helped Donald Trump, a presidential candidate contemptuous of constitutional barriers, personally. It has legitimized the unconstitutional ideological projects Trump pursued in his first presidential term. And it has advanced the self-empowering projects Trump plans to pursue if he wins a second. It actually kind of reminds me of the situation we were in with George W. Bush and warrantless surveillance and the passage after the fact of authorizing legislation and sort of bootstrapping this stuff to the authorization for the use of military force, right? He did things that were just not authorized by law, and then we essentially said, well, maybe there should be some immunity, both for, say, telecom companies who are helping conduct the surveillance and the president who ordered it. And we found, again, where after the fact, having been caught in an illegal and unconstitutional surveillance scheme, the accountability moment that we were afforded was reduced to that one 2004 election, after which, of course, Bush insisted on reminding everybody, I've had my accountability moment. That's all there is. So we've been there before, been dissatisfied, I think, with the results, but forgot about it and are back here again. Perversely, he continues, Roberts dignifies his conclusions by invoking the separation of powers. The decision instead represents a fundamental subversion of that principle, which centrally involves holding the executive to lawful account and ensuring that the prosecutorial powers of the state are not used for his or her political convenience. Such abuse is precisely what the court's immunity holding allows, and what a second Trump presidency, even more so now than before the court ruled, would promise. And I agree. I just don't understand how you get around to saying, well, what I did preserves the separation of powers. No, it erases it and ensures that there's no way of keeping the powers separate because the checks and balances against the executive are erased. Anyway, next section here, misconstruing the separation of powers. That's just what we're talking about here. In the court's decision, its conservative majority claims to reinforce basic constitutional principles. Indeed, Roberts' majority opinion is soaked in the language of the separation of powers. In considering the extent of a president's potential immunity from criminal prosecution, he writes, to resolve the matter, therefore, we look primarily to the framers' design of the presidency within the separation of powers, our precedent on presidential immunity in the civil context, and our criminal cases where a president resisted prosecutorial demands for documents. He later states, taking into account these competing considerations, we conclude that the separation of powers principles explicated in our precedent necessitate at least a presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for a president's acts within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. That's the quote. The court's majority's concession that a president might still be prosecuted for entirely unofficial acts, while obviously justified, pales in comparison to the sweeping protection it grants for abuses of official power. Again here, abuses of official power. That can happen. You can claim it's an official act, but it's really an abuse of the official power you're given. I ordered the FBI to murder you. Well, that's an official act. I ordered the FBI to do something. Yes, but you ordered them to murder someone, and that's unofficial. It can't be official. It's illegal. But of course they just erase the illegality of it. Well, regardless of whether it's legal or illegal, you can't be prosecuted for it because you were using an official mechanism. But no, that's exactly where the separation of powers and the checks and balances must be left intact. You cannot allow a president to come to think that it will be okay in terms of legal jeopardy if I do illegal things that may or may not benefit me personally using official resources. And that's exactly how Trump will come to understand it. He may even be wrong in the view of this court, but this court hasn't said so, and he will not construe it that way for them. But back to the article. Prosecutors hoping to overcome a presumption of presidential immunity will need to show, the opinion states, quote, that applying a criminal prohibition to a presidential act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. Demonstrating no danger whatsoever will likely be prohibitively hard for a prosecutor to do. Really, all a president has to do is claim that there's a danger, and then there's a presumption of danger, for one thing. But okay. The result is a betrayal of the full meaning of the U.S. Constitution's separation of powers. Next section, the founders and the danger of bold executive power. Separation of powers is a phrase that does not appear in the Constitution, but rather an idea that has been universally understood since the founding to animate the whole constitutional system. It is not just any distinction among agencies of the state. As I have discussed at length elsewhere, to which he links, it is an institutionalization of the rule of law, providing an articulated multi-step process in which the authority to formulate general rules of law, to adjudicate particular cases under those rules, and to enforce them by investigation, prosecution, and punishment are lodged in distinct institutions. This division, according to Montesquieu, the French political theorist who first articulated the idea, offers people the secure freedom of knowing that they will not be prosecuted and punished except in accordance with publicly promulgated and previously enacted general laws, and that their case will be heard by impartial judges rather than legislative cliques or cliques, as we would say, and maybe cliques, as he might say, or despotic executives with political agendas. The concept of institutionally mixed government was ancient, as was the idea of the rule of law. It was Montesquieu's innovation, however, to identify a judicial power as a constitutionally fundamental power and to map liberty under the rule of law onto an insulation of the judicial power from those of the legislative and executive powers. He also argued that 18th century England had gone further toward promoting freedom by also distinguishing the executive power of the king and his ministers from the legislative authority of Parliament. But there are two other important features in Montesquieu's formulation. One is that he, like the American founders who followed him, was careful not to treat separation as implying completely impervious barriers. The English monarch, for example, had the authority to veto legislation, as does the American president. The other is underscoring the constitutional importance of holding the executive power, including those who wield it, to legal account. In other words, the executive power that enforced the law must itself be subject to enforcement of the law in turn. This goal was so foundational as to justify vesting its exercise in a particularly powerful body. In England, the nobility, taking the form of the House of Lords in England, and, by implication, the judicial parliaments in France. In the English House of Lords, for example, held the authority to try impeachments of the king's executive ministers, an authority that extended not just to removal from office, but to imprisonment, loss of property, and even execution. They love executions. Such convictions, notably, were immune to monarchical pardons. Otherwise, it would be ridiculous, right? Just as notably, the most powerful nobles had the wealth and status to allow them to stand up to the king and his agents, as ordinary judges of the king's bench likely would not. Why were such extraordinary measures called for? Because the executive is uniquely able to sidestep the formal division of legal authority. After all, the goal of protecting secure freedom under law against political persecution does not only require that criminal trials happen before an independent judiciary, it also requires that the enforcement powers of the state not be used without such a criminal trial. As Montesquieu knew, regimes that engage in extrajudicial imprisonment, torture, and execution at the behest of the governing executive are all too common, whether there is officially a functioning independent judiciary in the country or not. More generally, a government's military, policing, and imprisoning powers, the violent agencies of executive power, have been threats to constitutional government and civil liberty whenever they were unleashed. Thus, historically, the separation of powers did not aim to unleash those powers in the name of letting the executive, as Roberts has it, boldly and fearlessly carry out his duties. No, in fact, I don't know whether he gets this or not, but there should be some element of fear in carrying out these duties. These are some heavy responsibilities. You need something, some reason to want to make sure that you're doing this properly, if you're doing it at all, or if there's any proper way of doing it. As England had institutionally discovered, and Montesquieu understood, making the separation of powers an effective institutionalization of the rule of law requires adding, not subtracting, political weight behind the legal control of executive powers in general and executive leaders in particular. Hence, the founders, the American founders, influenced by Montesquieu's gloss on the English Constitution, guarantee in the U.S. Constitution, not just that a president could be impeached in the U.S. House and removed from office by a trial in the U.S. Senate, but that even following removal from office, a former president shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment, meaning criminal punishment. Unlike in England, they vested the latter in courts of law with ordinary judicial procedures, but the core restraint on the executive remained the same. Note here, by the way, that Trump's lawyers earlier on, and I'm sure at some point in the future, should it become necessary, were arguing for a totally different reading of the phrase we just read, that a former president shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment, following removal from office. And he was saying, no, as part and parcel, in fact, of my claim of presidential immunity, I would remind you that the Constitution contemplates liability and being subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment after removal from office. But I haven't been removed from office. But yes, you have. You have been removed from office by a vote of the electorate. And thank God, in the end, they actually got the actual Electoral College certificates and counted those correctly. And you lost. You've been removed from office. Not by impeachment, but by being voted out. The explicit availability of both impeachment and criminal prosecution under the Constitution is, as Yale University legal scholar, if we care about Yale University legal scholars anymore, Akil Reed Amar noted last week, it says in this piece, but now several weeks ago, impossible to reconcile. This is, I have to start over again here so you have the flow of the sentence. The explicit availability of both impeachment and criminal prosecution under the Constitution is impossible to reconcile with Roberts's invention of criminal immunity for precisely these abuses of official power that are the central case of impeachable offenses. And as Dan Dresner, a Tufts University political scientist, has emphasized, the Federalist Papers reinforced the idea of the president's liability under criminal law by arguing that a virtue of a one-man presidency, one of the virtues of the idea, remember, it didn't have to be that way when they were writing the Constitution, but one virtue of a one-man presidency was that it made clear who should be held accountable for executive misconduct, including through criminal punishment. Unless, of course, we decide that, no, nobody should be held liable for that sort of misbehavior. Oh, well, too bad. The Trumpian past as prologue is the next section, 2017 to 2021, i.e. his first term. The Supreme Court's ruling addressed Trump's efforts to have all charges dismissed in his federal trial on 4 felony counts of attempting, in the months up to and including January 6, 2021, to overturn the results of the 2020 election and interfere in the electoral vote count. Reversing a compelling appeals court ruling that denied presidential criminal immunity and allowed the case to go forward, the majority sent the case back to the trial court to decide which, if any, of special counsel Jack Smith's election subversion indictments would survive. Because the court's expansive understanding of official action may include all of a president's public communications and any effort he justifies as maintaining election integrity, Trump may now escape legal accountability for his election subversion altogether. So why not do it again, right? Or any president, except if you're a Democrat, which they'll invent a new doctrine why it doesn't work for you. Thus, perversely, you might add, the court's undermining of criminal accountability arises out of Trump's efforts to avoid democratic accountability as well. Even that accountability moment is going to be erased. George W. Bush at least left that one for us, but now no. You can't use that one either, because if you do, I'll reverse it, and then you can't charge me with a crime for the work of reversing it. So, perversely, the court's undermining of criminal accountability arises out of Trump's efforts to avoid democratic accountability as well, after being rejected for re-election by the electorate. The combined effect suggests a vision of executive power that can't be held accountable by any means at all, whether in court or at the ballot box. The court's majority has, in effect, gone a very long way toward establishing the constitutional theory Trump memorably described as, quote, I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. And of course, he actually did say that. That's a quote. And it's a complete kindergarten understanding, if that, of what it means or what any of the words in that sentence mean. Trump's term in office was marked by executive lawlessness and an obsessive desire for impunity. He was certainly not alone among populist and nationalist leaders in that orientation, the impetus to focus the governing power of a nation in one man's will. Unobstructed by the legalism of courts, the proceduralism of the bureaucracy, or legislative debates with an opposition party, is one of the defining features of populist authoritarianism. U.S. presidents, too, chronically try to expand their power, but even by American standards, Trump stood out as trying to govern without legal constraint and as eager to free the violent agencies of executive power from such constraint. There were, for example, his attempts to govern without and against Congress, perfectly exemplified by his administration's illegal expenditure of funds that Congress had refused to allocate to build a wall on the border with Mexico. This was accompanied by his habit of filling cabinet and sub-cabinet positions with, you know what kind of employees? Acting employees to avoid Senate confirmation. By the way, all the more ironic in the face of Aileen Cannon's freelance decision to dismiss the charges in the documents case, the Mar-a-Lago documents case, because Jack Smith's appointment was somehow unconstitutional. I mean, that was his everyday practice for every kind of position. There were also his efforts to expand a lawless power to halt immigration. As I wrote in 2018, Trump's calls at the time for, quote, mass expulsions without judicial oversight or procedural protection would not only be a violation of international law and of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees due process to persons, that is, again, persons, not only citizens, but a grave threat to American residents, since due process is how we ensure that citizens and legal residents aren't among those swept up and deported. I don't know who I'm quoting here, but it's offered up as a quote. But maybe some of these links will help us figure out who said what. Although they looks like they, in addition to his own writing, they link back to Trump's own tweeting as well. So I imagine this is his own summation, though, of what Trump was calling for in his tweets. Consider, too, his hostility to legal accountability for the agents of state violence in general, not only in his own urge to unleash military violence against protesters, but also in, for example, his pardons of military personnel and contractors convicted of war crimes in Afghanistan and in Iraq, against the advice of military and Department of Defense leadership. He similarly pardoned a former police officer convicted of directing her police dog to attack a homeless, undocumented immigrant who had already surrendered. So in case you're thinking that things will get better in Gaza with respect to war crimes happening there with the election of Trump, no, I imagine not. Above all, there was Trump's quest to keep himself and those closest to him immune from legal scrutiny or accountability. Trump considered himself unbound by the Constitution's emoluments clauses. Is that right? I hadn't heard. Which prevent him from taking financial advantage of his office and the norm of disclosing tax returns. He went to extraordinary lengths to prevent and obstruct investigations into his campaign's links to Russia. He tried to use military aid to Ukraine for his personal political advantage against Democrat Joe Biden, and he used pardons as a carrot to keep potential witnesses against him quiet. It's particularly unsettling to note that many of the instances of the Trump administration's obstructions of justice, as identified in the Mueller report, would seem to be protected by the court's new ruling, which provides the president with absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for the use of core presidential powers and presumptive of immunity for all official actions. Whether someone acted corruptly, in other words, the motive behind their actions, is central to the charge of obstruction of justice, and it helps identify the difference between legal and illegal action. Yet Roberts insists, against a more careful concurrence by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, that the motives for the use of a presidential power may not be used to distinguish whether a presidential act is official or unofficial, and that official acts sit behind a veil that may not be pierced, even to find evidence of crimes. By granting the president criminal immunity and making the executive's obstruction of justice harder to prosecute and prove, the court has severely undermined the separation of powers. Next up, a new era of politicized federal prosecutions and regulatory actions, we are asked. Yes, it's also important to note that the court's decision gives cover to personalized and politicized federal prosecutions. In a reversal of the priorities of the separation of powers, Roberts makes it harder to prosecute the holder of executive power, but easier for him to direct the government's prosecution of his enemies. In the majority opinion, Roberts wrote, "The president may discuss potential investigations and prosecutions with his attorney general and other Justice Department officials to carry out his constitutional duty to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed." And the Attorney General, as head of the Justice Department, acts as the president's chief law enforcement officer. Not the Constitution's, the president's. Investigative and prosecutorial decision-making is the special province of the executive branch, and the Constitution vests the entirety of the executive power in the president. This description of the relationship between the presidency and the prosecutorial and investigative functions of the Department of Justice delegitimizes the norms and rules that have been put in place within the executive branch since the 1970s Watergate scandal to insulate those functions from direct political influence, or interference, as they say. Indeed, the ruling's characterization of the Attorney General as the president's, rather than the federal government's, chief law enforcement officer endorses precisely the view of that office that then President Trump constantly complained was not accepted by the Attorney General's, Jeff Sessions, or even, at times, Attorney General Bill Barr. Troublingly, the decision clearly gives cover to a president firing or threatening to fire the executive officers charged with federal investigations and prosecutions. In the Trump administration, this power would have included Trump's threatening to dismiss even, where's our button? Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen prior to January 6th for refusing to announce an investigation into supposed election fraud, and it would also have applied to the firing of FBI Director James Comey for investigating links between the Trump campaign and Russia. In the final months of his presidency, Trump issued an executive order creating a new federal civil service category of employment known as Schedule F. You've heard more about it, of course, since. Also an integral part of Project 2025. This order would have stripped career protections from tens of thousands of bureaucratic positions deemed to have a role in shaping policy and extending the president's ability to hire and fire based on partisan or personal loyalty, far down into the ranks of upper and mid-level employees. In other words, here too, a retroactive legalization, for instance, of George W. Bush's U.S. attorney's scandal. It was supposedly a big to-do, a big scandal to reach down and hire and fire U.S. attorneys based on personal or political loyalty. Schedule F not only legalizes it, and not only does the court's decision immunize it, but Schedule F allows for it to reach even further down into the ranks of any federal bureaucracy, well down below the ranks of the U.S. attorneys. Now, Trump's term ended before he could fully implement the order, but he has said he will reissue it immediately if he wins a second term or steals one. He means to go to war against the career civil service professionals who contradicted him in the past. That's the revenge. People he imagines make up conspiratorial deep state, a deep state, because they don't necessarily agree with his partisan goals. And given his past frustrations with Comey, Robert Mueller, Sessions, Barr, and Rosen, in some cases his own people, it's clear he means to bend the Department of Justice, including the FBI, to his will. Indeed, he has openly fantasized about using the investigative and prosecutorial tools of the federal government against his political enemies, starting with his 2016 campaign chants of "lock her up" regarding Hillary Clinton, and continuing through last week in calls to prosecute former Republican members of Congress and U.S. House January 6th committee member Liz Cheney in a televised military tribunal. Come on. The Roberts opinions discussion of the executive branch not only implied a stamp of approval of Schedule F, it also explicitly sanctioned direct presidential interference in the use of federal investigations and prosecutions. The ruling virtually ensures that the norms that barely held during Trump's first term would get swept away in his second. A central purpose of the Constitution's separation of powers is to protect liberty. Remember that? Libertarians protect liberty by constraining the executive's lawless use of the policing and punishing branches of the state, and to bolster those constraints by ensuring that the holders of executive authority may themselves be held to account. As president, Trump sought to reject those structures of accountability, and if reelected, he will do so again. Sadly, the Roberts Court has facilitated this effort, gutting the separation of powers while claiming to entrench it. Sound like any Republican national conventions you've heard about lately? Unity. We're here for unity and healing and coming together. Let's murder everyone who isn't white. Okay, well, golly, that seems like you're not really living up to the sloganeering. Much like your own Supreme Court. How odd. Well put. Thanks to Jacob Levy for that one, and maybe the fourth or fifth pronunciation of his name so far. Now, here's one that you may already have heard the background of, and maybe even read the news stories when they came out, but I feel like I wanted to double back and include this on the record for our show on a day like today. It's the Washington Post's report from all the way back on June 3rd of this year from Philip Bump on the end, finally, the ignominious end of 2,000 Mules. The title of the piece, 2 years later, obvious misinformation is finally taken down. 2,000 Mules is a case study in how appealing, lucrative falsehoods endure. And he writes it up this way. He says, I was sitting at dinner with my editor in early 2022 when filmmaker, Dinesh D'Souza challenged me to a debate. I had written an article assessing claims from the right-wing group True the Vote, alleging that millions of ballots had been collected during the 2020 presidential election and dropped into ballot boxes in an effort to influence the election results. Well, I mean, they were. Millions of ballots were collected and dropped into ballot boxes in an effort to influence the election results. That was people voting. But, they're saying there was something wrong with that. Of course, that was an effort to influence election results that, in the words of the group's Greg Phillips, constituted an organized crime that was perpetrated on Americans. I can think of at least some other organized crimes perpetrated on Americans, but hey, who am I? The analysis from True the Vote was at the center of a movie that D'Souza was preparing for release, hence his challenge to me. I quickly accepted, and D'Souza provided me a copy to review. My initial assessment of True the Vote's claims, which ran under the prescient headline, Ballot Trafficking is the Next Front in the Unending Fight Over 2020, that assessment noted that the group's methodology couldn't accomplish what it claimed to have accomplished. The group, allegedly acting on a tip about a ballot collection effort, used cell phone geolocation data to identify thousands of people that they dubbed mules, that's where it comes from, who had visited several ballot drop boxes in the weeks before the election. But there were countless obvious problems with that assessment, including that the geolocation data wasn't sufficiently refined to allow that sort of determination, and that the examples offered by True the Vote at a hearing in Wisconsin showed people moving all over certain cities, including on streets near places that had ballot boxes. In other words, if you passed 2 ballot boxes inside of a week of one another in 2 different locations in the city, you're a mule now, and they were going to accuse you of election interference. D'Souza's movie, 2,000 Mules, did not make a better case. After viewing it, I walked through the gaps in its arguments, including that there was no evidence of any scheme outside the alleged analysis from True the Vote, remarkable operational security from an alleged multi-state illegal conspiracy involving thousands of people. When D'Souza and I finally discussed the movie, he was unable to make a more compelling case or address the obvious gaps in his argument. For the most part, he defaulted to True the Vote's analysis and claims fraught, given that Phillips had a record, linked herein, of making unsubstantiated claims about fraud. From the outset, in other words, the claims in 2,000 Mules and the assessments of True the Vote were not credible. That lack of credibility only increased over time. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, for example, indicated that it would not launch a probe into the alleged activity, asking True the Vote to reveal its whistleblower. The group ultimately said it had no names of whistleblowers to offer. The group promised to release all its information for public scrutiny before announcing that it wouldn't. There was one map of the visits to drop boxes made by an alleged mule shown in the movie, but Phillips told the Washington Post that it was fake. Why? I don't know, but okay, he did. What the movie did have, though, was an argument that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump. An argument that was cleverly cloaked in the aesthetic of a serious investigation and a complicated data-driven examination. D'Souza explicitly argued that there was enough ballot movement to affect the election outcomes, relying, as he told me during our conversation, on True the Vote's ability to enhance video from a handful of ballot drop boxes, which was then extrapolated to every mule everywhere. So the movie got a screening at Mar-a-Lago and enormous attention from Trump and his allies. There were, quote, so many things, unquote, that happened in 2020, Trump claimed earlier this year at a rally in New Hampshire. And then his famous tale, you take a look at True the Vote, where they have tens of thousands of people stuffing the ballot boxes. Even D'Souza never claimed a number that high, but accuracy has never been Trump's watchword. That he continued to hype these allegations after they were debunked is evidence to that end. The film was produced in part by Salem Media Group, a right-wing outlet that hosts many prominent voices on its radio network. We don't have one. Anyway, in our conversation, D'Souza said that an approving panel of commentators shown in the film that included some of them, like Charlie Kirk, Dennis Prager, and Sebastian Gorka, was a request from Salem. Salem also distributed the film and published a companion book that made the same claims. That book was an early point of embarrassment for Salem and D'Souza. After being sent to some stores, it was pulled to be rewritten, apparently because the initial version of the book identified specific nonprofit groups that D'Souza alleged had participated in the non-existent ballot stuffing effort. This triggered understandable concerns about lawsuits. True the Vote claimed at the time that they hadn't identified those organizations to D'Souza. It was a lawsuit from another source that led to Salem pulling the movie from its streaming platform late last week. A Georgia man named Mark Andrews had done members of his family a favor before Election Day in 2020 by collecting their ballots and dropping them in a ballot box. This was legal under Georgia law, and the authorities in the state cleared Andrews of any wrongdoing in May of 2022, a few days before 2,000 Mules was released. But the film still features Andrews putting his family's ballots in a drop box, with D'Souza describing it as a crime in the voiceover. Andrews is also shown in the book with a caption calling it organized crime. Andrews sued D'Souza and True the Vote and Salem, among others. Late Friday afternoon, way back at the beginning of June, Salem Media Group released a statement. Ahem. We apologize for the hurt the inclusion of Mr. Andrews' image in the new movie, book, and promotional materials have caused Mr. Andrews and his family, it read, in part. We have removed the film from Salem's platforms, and there will be no future distribution of the film or the book by Salem. Representatives for D'Souza and Andrews' legal team did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Salem put the blame squarely on representations made to us by Dinesh D'Souza and True the Vote. Representations that were not credible, even before the movie came out, as I wrote in early April of 2022. In our conversation, D'Souza indicated that he was relying on the representations from True the Vote. Those reliances were, by all accounts, lucrative. The film was the 13th most popular movie in movie theaters in the country the week it debuted, and eventually grossed, and it really did gross, more than $1 million in theaters, despite being primarily distributed by streaming. Its errors were obvious soon after its release, but it was a cash cow. It was also essential to Trump and his supporters, as his January comments make clear. At last, here was putative evidence of the fraud they simply knew must have occurred. It didn't, and it was always obvious. But sometimes the truth not only takes 2 years to get its boots on, it only reaches for its boots once it receives a subpoena. Just wanted to bring you up to date and make sure you knew the story, the ultimate fate of 2,000 Mules.
From netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
So that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Another semi-successful 1-hour show during our hiatus away from the microphone. Hope I put a coherent one together for you. There's a very coherent one coming up that's like one story. I don't even know how we're going to summarize that one. It's going to drive Scott up the wall, but we'll be back with it on Friday.